In 1324, a king left West Africa and crossed the Sahara. He wasn't invading anyone. He wasn't chasing new territory. He was going to Mecca. But wherever he went, gold went with him. Thousands are said to have traveled with him. Officials, soldiers, merchants, servants, and camels loaded with gold. Exactly how many and exactly how much gold, historians still argue about that. The medieval writers who recorded it were not counting for a modern audience. They were telling a story about a king almost too rich to imagine. Then he reached Cairo, and something strange happened to the price of gold. He spent, he gave, he handed out gold by the load, and for years afterward, people in Cairo remembered it. Because, according to one witness who was there, the value of gold itself hadn't fully recovered. One man's pilgrimage had become an economic event. His name was Mansa Musa. To understand Musa's wealth, we first need to understand the empire he ruled. Forget today's borders. Travel back roughly 700 years to medieval West Africa. Here stood the Mali Empire. At its height, one of the largest states in the world, stretching across parts of what are now Mali, Senegal, Guinea, and neighboring countries. Mali sat at a crossroads, between the gold-producing forests and river valleys to the south, and the trade networks of the Sahara and North Africa to the north. And one commodity made this empire famous far beyond its own borders: gold. For centuries before Musa was even born, gold mined in the river valleys of Bambouk and Bouré, in the region of what's now Senegal, Mali, and Guinea, moved north across the desert. Salt moved the other way, mined from desert deposits like Taghaza, hundreds of kilometers into the Sahara, and carried south, where it was sometimes worth its weight in gold. Medieval Arab geographers described an almost theatrical trading system. Merchants leaving goods on the ground, gold sellers leaving their own beside it, neither side ever meeting face to face. Historians call this silent trade. How literally it worked is debated, but it captures something real. The sources of Mali's gold were treated as closely guarded secrets. Today, governments think strategically about resources the same way. Oil, natural gas, lithium, semiconductors, and the shipping routes that move them. In Musa's world, gold was that resource, the one sitting at the center of wealth, trade, and political power. And Mali, more than any other state of its era, controlled it. His name wasn't actually Mansa. That was a title, roughly king or emperor, used by Mali's rulers. His given name was Musa. Musa became ruler of Mali around 1312, though even that date carries some uncertainty, since medieval chroniclers didn't always agree on the length of a reign. He ruled for roughly a quarter century, until his death sometime in the 1330s. Sources differ on the exact year. Some say 1332, others 1337. But comparing his fortune to a modern billionaire's creates a real problem. A billionaire today might own shares in public companies. We can check a stock price and estimate what those shares are worth on any given afternoon. Musa's world didn't work that way. His wealth wasn't separate from his empire. It was his empire. The gold fields, the trade routes running through his territory, the taxes and tribute owed to him, and the authority to command all of it. There was no stock exchange calculating his fortune, no audited balance sheet, no Bloomberg terminal announcing. So, when you see an article claiming Musa was worth exactly $400 billion, be skeptical. We'll come back to that number. Because the real story is more interesting than a single figure. In 1324, Musa set out on the journey that would make his wealth famous far beyond West Africa. Musa was Muslim, and like any Muslim who is able, he was expected to perform the Hajj, the pilgrimage to Mecca, at least once in his lifetime. But this wasn't one traveller crossing the desert. Medieval accounts describe a genuinely enormous procession accompanying him. Exactly how enormous depends on which account you read. One near-contemporary source puts his attendance in the thousands. A chronicler, writing decades later, describes tens of thousands, along with dozens of camels carrying nothing but gold. Historians today treat those specific numbers with real caution. They read less like a head count and more like medieval shorthand for more than anyone could count. But strip away the exact figures, and the broader picture still holds. This was one of the largest, most lavish royal caravans anyone in the region had ever seen. Imagine the logistics. People, animals, food, water, shelter, security, gold, and well over 4,000 kilometers of Sahara and savanna between Mali and Cairo alone, long before he'd even reached Mecca. They crossed the Sahara along established caravan routes through trading towns like Walata, pressing toward Egypt. Along the way, Musa is said to have prayed publicly, built a mosque on the spot each Friday, and given gold to towns and individuals he passed. These are the kinds of details that appear in near-contemporary Arabic accounts, genuinely reported, but still someone else's telling. Not a diary Musa kept himself. Eventually, the ruler of Mali reached one of the great cities of the medieval Islamic world. Cairo, under the Mamluk Sultanate, was one of the great commercial and political capitals of its age. And Musa arrived carrying something its markets understood very well: gold. The clearest account of what happened next comes from Shihab al-Din al-Umari, a Damascene scholar who visited Cairo about a dozen years later and interviewed people who remembered the visit firsthand. Al-Umari wrote that Musa flooded Cairo with his benefactions, that he left, in his words, no court emir nor holder of a royal office without the gift of a load of gold. Cairo's merchants, Al-Umari noted, made extraordinary profits, buying and selling to Musa's enormous retinue. And this is where a medieval pilgrimage becomes an economics lesson. Imagine a market where gold is relatively scarce, and its exchange rate against silver coinage has held fairly steady for years. Then a ruler arrives and pours a significant new quantity of gold into that same market, all at once. Basic economics suggests what should happen next. Increase the supply of something suddenly enough, and its relative value tends to fall. According to Al-Umari, that's roughly what happened. He records gold's exchange rate slipping, and he says it stayed depressed for about 12 years afterward. Modern historians take that account seriously, but they're also careful with it. Al-Umari was writing down what merchants told him more than a decade after the fact, not measuring prices with modern instruments. So the precise size and duration of the effect is debated. Some scholars think Al-Umari's picture is broadly right. Others think later writers exaggerated it into something closer to legend. What isn't in doubt is this: Musa's arrival was memorable enough that a scholar writing a generation later could still find people in Cairo talking about it. Banjunri, herding sparishly. I don't just provide Interrogal with soberly something throwable. His passiath hearth each other at the mention of virally. That's a different kind of wealth than owning something valuable. That's being wealthy enough to bend, even briefly, the economy of one of the largest cities on earth. Stories about the ruler of Mali traveled. Merchants talked. Travelers talked. Arab chroniclers wrote his story into their histories, and about 50 years later, something remarkable appeared in European cartography. The Catalan Atlas, created around 1375 by the Majorcan cartographer Cresques Abraham, and preserved today in the National Library of France in Paris. There, drawn as a crowned ruler holding a gold nugget and seated on a golden throne, is Mansa Musa. The atlas's own caption calls him the richest and noblest ruler of that particular region, due to the abundance of gold gathered in his land. Notice what it doesn't say. It doesn't call him the richest man who ever lived, anywhere, in all of history. That specific claim is something later writers, much later, layered on top of the map. What the Catalan Atlas actually shows us is narrower and in some ways more interesting. By the late 1300s, half a century after his pilgrimage, mapmakers in Christian Europe, who had likely never set foot in West Africa, already knew Musa's name and already associated it with almost unimaginable gold. Long before television, before photography, before the internet, the ruler of a West African empire had become an international symbol of wealth. But remembering Musa only for gold misses an important part of the story. His reign is closely associated with a wave of religious building, expanded ties to the wider Muslim world, and the rise of one particular city, Timbuktu. Timbuktu had existed as a trading settlement for at least a century before Musa. But in the years after his pilgrimage, it grew into one of the most important commercial and intellectual centers in West Africa. Musa's patronage is linked to the building of the Jingureba Mosque, still standing in Timbuktu today, one of the oldest mud brick mosques in West Africa. For a long time, popular accounts credited an Andalusian poet, Musa, brought back from Mecca, Abu Ishaq al-Sahili, as the mosque's architect, importing a foreign design into West Africa. More recent scholarship complicates that story. Historians studying the building itself argue that al-Sahili's role was more organizational than architectural, and that the mosque's design reflects centuries of West African earthen building traditions, not something imported wholesale from abroad. Around the same period, Timbuktu became known for a different kind of wealth, scholarship, centered on the Sankore Mosque. Manuscripts on law, astronomy, and theology circulated. Students and teachers moved between Timbuktu and centers of learning across North Africa and the Middle East. It's sometimes called a university, though it worked less like a single campus and more like a dense network of independent scholars' mosques and private libraries, a distinction historians care about, even if the popular version of the story usually skips it. Possessing valuable resources can create wealth, but turning that wealth into institutions, trade, and knowledge can create influence that outlasts any one ruler's lifetime, sometimes by centuries. Now let's deal with the number you've probably seen online: $400 billion. Sometimes higher. Was Mansa Musa really worth that much? The responsible answer is, we don't know, and we probably never will. How much is control over a medieval trade network worth in today's dollars? How do you price political authority over an empire the size of Western Europe? How do you translate access to 14th century goldfields into a 21st century balance sheet? There is no reliable formula for any of that. So claiming Musa was worth exactly $400 billion creates an illusion of precision the historical evidence simply can't support. But Musa doesn't need a modern dollar figure to make his story extraordinary. His pilgrimage attracted enormous attention in his own lifetime. His gold became legendary within a generation. His reputation crossed the Sahara, the Mediterranean, and centuries. And nearly 700 years later, we're still arguing about how rich he actually was. That, on its own, tells you something. But enormous wealth couldn't freeze history in place. Musa died in the 1330s. His son, Magan, and later his brother, Suleiman, inherited a powerful, wealthy state. But maintaining an empire takes more than valuable resources. It takes stable succession, military strength, and control of trade routes that rival powers also wanted. Over the following century, Mali's grip weakened. Succession disputes, pressure from Tuareg and Mossi raiders, and the rise of a rival power along the Niger River all took their toll. That rival was Songhai. Through the reign of Sunni Ali in the later 1400s, Songhai seized Timbuktu and other former Mali trading cities and became the region's dominant power in Mali's place. Gold had helped build and sustain extraordinary power. But gold alone couldn't preserve it forever. 700 years later, Musa's world isn't as distant as it seems. Gold, oil, natural gas, lithium, semiconductors, shipping lanes. The resources change. The struggle for economic power doesn't. Countries still compete for access to resources, technology, and trade routes the rest of the world depends on. And wealth becomes especially powerful when it creates influence far beyond the borders where it originated, the way one king's gold once did, 4,000 kilometers from home. Maybe Mansa Musa was the richest person who ever lived. Maybe he wasn't. On the evidence we actually have, we'll probably never know for certain. But nearly 7 centuries after his death, we're still talking about his wealth. Fortunes disappear, currencies change, empires collapse. But some stories become priceless. Centuries later, another man would build a fortune so dominant it controlled nearly all of American oil, until the US government decided it had grown too powerful to remain in one piece.